Hello all together here in Edith Marian's house near the Goethe-Arnum and hopefully also on some other places. Welcome in the name of the General Anthroposophical Section here at the Goethe-Arnum for the School of Spiritual Science. And tonight, we will focus on the occasion, on the event is maybe not the right word for what happened 100 years ago here on the hill. This marvelous and also deeply touching course for curative education started here on the hill, Dornach Hill, and since then it became a worldwide movement. Social therapy, curative education, social inclusive assistance and development. It is in our time such a needed, worldwide needed task. And we decided to focus on the curative education course and focus specifically on one child, one destiny of the course. And then in the second part of this evening, Constanza Kaliks will talk about the central meditation maybe of the curative education course, point and circle. And we will see how it will fit together. This human destiny approach, which is a difficult one, and a meditation recommended by Dr. Steiner, which is not so easy to understand why this one, but hopefully will come closer to the light at the end of our meeting. So yesterday night, or yesterday, was the 3rd of July. So this day when Dr. Steiner presented 100 years ago in the 8th lecture of the curative education course, also the story, but not only the story, but also the boy Wilfried Emanuel Kunert to the audience. And yeah, we will try to come a little bit closer to the situation of this boy, of the parents, and the whole moving story. It is a kind of a riddle, kind of a mystery. I think most of you will know that this boy couldn't be healed and he died quite early. That means months after Dr. Steiner's own departure, own death. Wilfried Emanuel died on the 30th of November 1925, so 1.5 years after the course and only a little bit more than 2 years on earth, more or less touching the earth. No fully incarnation was possible this time. And I think most of you know about the story in the course, and some of you maybe will be well aware of Mother's report. Theodora Krück von Potocin was the name of this famous anthroposophical writer, author, but not many of the readers knew that she is also the mother of this child out of the curative education course, because her report on the boy was published late after her death, and it was not in the bookshops. It was more or less confidentially given to those who feel close to the curative education in an anthroposophical understanding. And later on, Wilhelm Uhlenhoff opened other aspects of this history of Wilfried Emanuel. And then in the Ita Wegman Archive and Institute, 15 years ago, we discovered a lot of materials, letters of the parents, of the godmother, which was Elisabeth Frede, and details of the medical history. And we also published a little booklet about Wilfried Emanuel Kunert. So I will start very shortly with the mother, and you'll see also a first picture, the young Theodora von Potrozyn. It is a photography of 1915 in the middle of the First World War. She grew up in Austria, born in Innsbruck, and visited boarding schools in Belgium and in England. And then in the middle of the First World War, she started to study economy, social economy in University Heidelberg in Germany. Maybe 2 years or 1.5 years, because after the war directly, she worked as a social worker in Austria. We don't know the details, but maybe it was too obvious for her that it's not a time to study but to help, but I don't know. We also know that later on she continued her academic studies in Leipzig, where she became familiar with anthroposophy, first time in her life, and I don't know if it was because of Ernst Kunert or together with Ernst Kunert, another student of music science, and you see the second image, photography of him. They fell in love, and they were both students or scholars of anthroposophy as well. You see a very serious, a very sharp face. We don't know much, unfortunately, about the history of this man. I only could find out that he had 4 years in the First World War, as many young people at this time. Traumatic years in a traumatic war, and also became very, very ill with malaria, severe malaria. And in a way, maybe the experiences of war are inscribed in the face or even in the biography of Ernst Kunert. But they were quite happy to find each other, and they married quite soon in summer 1922. And at the end of the year 1922, they got aware that they were waiting for a child. So the main problem was the economical situation in Germany and of these two students at this time. They were absolutely poor in a poor country, in a poor and not only a poor country, but there was a general atmosphere of depression and political radicalization, and an enormous part of the population had no more jobs, and the inflation was growing from month to month, especially in the next year, 23. And they didn't know what to do in preparing the birth. So she had the idea that maybe she could gain a little kind of money in Switzerland, in the center of anthroposophy near the Goethe-Arnhem. She asked if she can work there as a chambermaid. And she got the allowance to come in, but she realized that it was too much for her, the physical work in this early pregnancy. We don't know much about the time. She spent there 3 months at the Goethe-Arnhem. She saw the ruins of the first Goethe-Arnhem every day. It was destroyed, as you know, in the turning point of the years, New Year's Eve, 22 till 23, as a symbol maybe of a Middle European situation, but also as a symbol of the actual state at this time of the anthroposophical society and movement, the reputation or the lacking reputation in the public, or better to say, being partly a victim of the radicalization of political aggressiveness and so on. Even if Switzerland was kind of a protected sphere, this kind of forces came over the border, as we know nowadays in detail about the destruction of the first Goethe-Arnhem. But she could find a little bit work in the neighborhood of Elisabeth Frede. Maybe you know her or know her quite well. She was the first, later on the first section leader for astronomy and mathematics at the Goethe-Arnhem. She had a PhD. She was a scientist, natural scientist, but a deep grounded anthroposophist as well. And at this time she was, apart from other tasks, creating a Rudolf Steiner archive here at the Goethe-Arnhem, because she had the idea that if this will become a school for spiritual science, this is mainly based on Steiner's scientific outcomes, scientific discoveries. So for her, the lectures Steiner had given, the books he had published, are not only interesting, but also a highly esteemed spiritual academic challenge. And she created the first complete archive for Steiner's lectures and books. But they were not only all present there, but they were also accessible to the public and also to scholars who came to ask, who wanted to make a PhD or just personal studies. They could come and not only read, they could ask Elisabeth Frede for advice, because she has maybe the best capacities at this time in having an overview about what has Steiner brought. In all those lectures, in all those places, parallel to Marie Steiner, she followed Steiner's lectures since more than 2 decades. But she had it all in her mind, in her incredible brain and mind. So she was brilliant. And Theodora Kunert, which was her name after the marriage, Theodora Kunert could help Elisabeth Frede, and this was not physically so hard. But only for 3 months, and then in April she left Switzerland, going to Austria, maybe to inform the family about the pregnancy in these poor times. I only know her remark, quietly fighting against the Catholic baptism of the child. So she came out of a Catholic family, and obviously they wanted to have the child baptized in their conventional Catholic manner. And then she returned back to Leipzig in June. So 7 months of pregnancy. But they couldn't find, it's a little bit like at a turning point of time, they couldn't find an apartment, a hotel to live and for the birth, because there were no rooms to rent for a price possible for those students. And at the end, they got a little room, or better to say, they got a little sofa in the house far away from Leipzig. It's on the path from Berlin to Hamburg, where an old relative of Ernst Kunert was living, and she accepted the wife of Ernst for the delivery. So on a hunchbacked, round-shaped sofa, very old. So humble conditions, very modest, or let's say poor. And so the boy was born 3rd of August, 1923, in a little village called Osterburg. Father was in Leipzig that day, but came soon. And then in a letter describing, the boy looked exactly as I had imagined him. And the midwife said that she had never seen such a beautiful child in 30 years, and that she would like to have a photo of him when he grew up. So a wonderful beginning for the child, and 5 days before the birth happened, Theodora Kunert sent a letter to Dr. Steiner, or maybe also a telegram, but I think she couldn't afford telegrams. I don't know. She asked Dr. Steiner not only for advice, but for a name for the coming soul, because we were convinced, she explained later, that an individuality which, according to the words of Novalis, dies as a spirit in order to be born as a human being, would have a very specific name. And this very specific name was probably given to the mothers in earlier times, but I didn't dare to choose the right one. So she asked Dr. Steiner, and he answered from England, from Ilkley, Great Britain, where he was for an educational course, mit herzlichem Gedenken. So maybe to translate with heartfelt attention or remembrance to Wilfried Emanuel. So the name was there. And the mother said it was the only treasure we could give the son for his arrival on earth. But quite unexpectedly, 1-2 weeks later, she underwent a certain inner crisis, very surprising for her. In the second week, it was not only a soul, also a physical crisis. I developed fever. I looked out of the window and heard myself saying, everything is over. I thought I saw something dark and evil outside the windows over the whole wide summery land. So it was a wonderful warm summer, mid of August 23, and of course there was poverty and political instability, but this was not on the countryside visible out of the window, but she felt it inwardly. We know from medicine that sometimes there are postpartum depressions, but this was not a typical one. It came very suddenly and went away, but she had special inner sensations. But not only she, what happened are kind of epileptic seizures happened to the child. And they were worrying, of course, the parents, especially also Ernst Kunert. I mentioned epileptic, but this is wrong, because just seizures, and it is quite often with young children unsure where it's from. It could be a kind of an epileptic disease, but this is a question of diagnosing and prognosis. At this time, they asked a very famous anthroposophical doctor, Ludwig Noll, and he said, after a detailed description by the father, that they won't mean much for the child. In a way, he was right, because these activities of seizure stopped. But what did not stop was kind of an inner insecurity of the mother and also of the father. And also what went on were the inner struggles of Theodora with her Catholic family over confessional questions. But they decided to do what they found right and went to the Christian community in Leipzig, and there were Rudolf Frieling and Johannes Perzel, and so the child was baptized there and taken into the community of Christ Jesus. And the godmother became Elisabeth Frede, this expert for stars and cosmic questions, expert for point and circle in a way. And she sent to the baptism, to the event of the baptism, a long letter to her godchild. And I quote one sentence, and at the end of my presentation, I quote more. The one sentence for now is, "It seems to me that I have known you for a long time." This is a surprising sentence for those who know a little bit about Elisabeth Frede. She was a very serious person. She didn't like at all speculations. And for me, it was always touching that she came to such an inner conclusion. Haven't seen the child, but felt connected, and writing, having known each other or having known you for a long time. So I don't know exactly when this happened, but the baptism by the letter is from the 6th of October. He's born in August, so we have a 3-month-old child, and this is the third photograph. You'll see Wilfried Emanuel at the age of 3 months. The mother is describing he had grown, had a firm, beautiful body, and his head, which has been very small at birth, was also growing. A real thinker, said the proud father when he came to visit us on Sunday. She was still living in this little village Osterburg. For the first time, I looked at a baby at the same age who was already lifting his little head. Why isn't mine ready yet? I asked the child carer. His head is just heavy, she replied, and I realized that she wasn't praising him. A starting and intensified insecurity, and she realized that he, Wilfried Emanuel, really had problems in lifting the head. Then they had a chance to get a room in Leipzig in December 23, and she said in her memories, several people saw the boy, so when they were out, and all asked if we didn't go to the doctor because of the conspicuously large head. We laughed about it at first and eventually became anxious ourselves. And shortly before Christmas and the Christmas conference here on the hill 1 year after the destruction, they went to the doctor, to a neurologist who was a member of the Anthroposophical Society in Leipzig for advice, and also consulted a conventional pediatrician. And this pediatrician diagnosed hydrocephalus and recommended urgent intervention. He said, and they asked what kind of, and he said, yes, we can do a lumbar puncture. That means to help the liquid water to flow out, but of course it doesn't heal at all. You have to repeat it all the time. And then if this doesn't work enough, then there is a final solution, a new method of brain surgery where they could try to create a broad communication between the central ventricles. And then they hope that then the fluid is better absorbed by what we call in medicine the subarachnoidal sphere. But I don't know if they maybe consulted textbooks at this time. There was a famous one, a textbook of surgery, which was just published in 23. And they said that this operation was only successfully in individual cases, and also these successes were at the end not pleasing. And I did some little research, and 20 years later, the same authors of the textbook in the next edition said, in retrospective, that all these procedures were completely unsuccessful. So years later, they had to commit that it ended with a death, and it is not a healing procedure. So in fact, there was no. What we have today as possibilities, they were not available at this time. What to do? So that the risky operation, which was culminating in death, presumably, or just wait. Our third option, we carried the little one in front of the lights of our Christmas tree and didn't want to admit to ourselves that he wasn't looking at them. Someone sent us a copy of Dürer's Jesus Child, so the drawing of Dürer, with the addition, the Jesus Child of Dürer looks like your boy. I clung to the hope, it is all the text of the mother, that Dürer has not also, I clung to the hope that Dürer has also seen such children's head and had not found them sick at all. Only our closest friends knew about our concern, each of them naming a different doctor who would know what to do. So some of you may know such a situation where in a totally desperate situation, all you ask have different ideas, but in fact there is no secure path. And she came to the conclusion, as she said later, that as in old times, the great knowers are probably the great healers. So better to ask Dr. Steiner for advice. And Ernst Kunert agreed, and they wrote to the godmother, Elisabeth Frede, and she directly asked Steiner, and he directly encouraged Ita Wegmann to send a letter to them that they must see the child, can't give advice from the far distance. So Ernst Kunert, you see the fourth picture hopefully now, is sending a letter to Ita Wegmann. This is his handwriting, end of January 1924. And he's more or less telling Ita Wegmann the arrival of his wife with the boy. So they left Leipzig on the 30th of January 1924. Yeah, they have, of course, only the third-class ticket. So that means at this time it was a night train to Basilea with a wooden bench. And yeah, I drove through the night, she's telling later. I hardly dared to get up from the wooden bench once. The boy was sleeping next to me on his pillow. How old is the child? Asked a fellow traveler. 5 months, I said hesitantly, and I realized that she was pensively silent. So finally they arrived at Basel-Badischer Bahnhof. It was a Thursday in the early afternoon, 31st of January 1924, and Elisabeth Frede was standing there with a bright, confident smile, as Theodora Kunert memorized, and looked to her godson in the arms of the mother and said, yes, you can see, it's good that you have come. And finalized, she said, now I could breathe again in this nearness. And then she came with Elisabeth Frede to her house Frede, with a wonderful foundation stone verse by Steiner. It is a long kind of meditation. The last 3 lines were the blessing of the Spirit and God's grace in all those who live inside. Inside this little house, which is not so little, the blessing of the dear Spirit and God's grace. So it was a blessed home ground, and she was invited to stay there at the beginning with the boy and waiting for a date with Ita Wegmann and Rudolf Steiner. So it was easy, quite easy, to get a date with Ita Wegmann next morning, and then they had a little bit to wait for Rudolf Steiner, who was not there at this time, who was in Stuttgart. So in the morning, she probably walked down from Haus Frede, some of you will know the place, to the Ita Wegmann Clinic, the Clinical Therapeutical Institute, how it was called. A wonderful little walk. And she said her institute was by no means a hospital. It was a larger house, a villa, so to speak. And it stood in a densely overgrown garden with a large apple tree marking the entrance. How beautiful it must have been when it was in bloom. The house didn't smell of disinfectant. The consulting room was a familiar little study where I laid my son wrapped in a white on the sofa. I only knew Dr. Wegmann by sight from the 3 months she lived in Dornach the year before. And she didn't know me at all, but she greeted me like a friend with a unique mixture of protective motherliness and girlish freshness. She looked at my son as if he were her child. Every woman who has a problem child has more than 5 senses for such perceptions. I told her what needed to be told. Her gaze took on a soulful strength, and her slender fingers touched Wilfried's head very softly. I already felt him secure. Then she straightened up and said, I can't tell you any more than the other doctors. The treatment they have suggested to you would probably not help much. So Dr. Steiner will have to guess what to do. And on Monday, 3 days later, they got a date, and Dr. Steiner came back. And first of all, it was Hilmar Walter, who, the assistant of Ita Wegmann, took the medical report, and you see in the next photograph, this original medical report of Hilmar Walter in Hilmar Walter's handwriting, how it was common at this time and still is quite common on such a little card. So the important medical aspects and also answers from the mother, because of course Dr. Walter asked. And later on, Dr. Steiner came in this little room. It was Ita Wegmann's office, and then was reading the report of Hilmar Walter and posed some other questions. And then she said in her memory, Dr. Steiner stood up, sat down at the head of the sofa where Wilfried Emanuel was lying, felt the baby's fontanelles, tickled the little one's face, the sole of his foot, and his calf. I was asked by Dr. Steiner whether he was very sensitive to light, hearing and touch, and I answered in an affirmative way. Did he sleep a lot and how? A lot and well, I said. And then it was emphasized, it's a case of illness that doesn't happen often, not often at all. And then Dr. Steiner asked what has been done so far and what the doctors offered to do, want to do. And she described first the lumbar puncture and later on this kind of brain surgery. And if that doesn't help, he asked. And then he asked if she would be prepared to go through with the treatment that would be offered her in the clinic here. I think he realized, she said later, that there was no question for me. And then in his black suit, he bent over the white bundle of a child, took the tiny hand in his and held the other on Wilfried Emanuel's heart. He raised his head pensively, and his dark eyes gazed into immeasurable distances. And then it came with all deliberation. I saw it, and I felt it was in his gaze. Steiner said, I can clearly see what is wrong with him. She said, I felt it. It was in his gaze. It was in his voice. It was so tangible in the room that I thought I must be able to see it too through his strength. A wonderful calm smoothed over me. My son's fate was absorbed into a care that came from far away and reached far beyond the here and now. There was a mysterious thread between this great man, whose true nature I only could guess, and the little one, who was now called my son, in this soundless silence, it probably only lasted a few minutes, I felt as if I was witnessing something that I was not really worthy of, and my breath caught in my throat from the fear of disturbing the moment. And she started to cry. This is a report more than 40 years later, which is good to keep in mind. It is not next day. But she had quite a brilliant memory, and in detailed memory in her whole lifetime. And yeah. And at the end, she said, Dr. Steiner said, we will do what we can do, but we can't make you any specific promises. This disease doesn't occur very often, and there are healing factors that have not yet been observed in a child. And then he asked also, where are you going to stay with a child during the treatment? And she said he asked with a kind of care that extended to the small material conditions of life, the daily life, and that would often affect me in the future. So of course we don't know, and she didn't know, what Steiner perceived. Months later, he described, and this was yesterday from the date of the century, it was in the 8th lecture of the Curative Education course, which happened at the 3rd of July, 1924. He described, I think, part of what he perceived in the first meeting, but I can't say it in detail because since then he saw the boy quite often. It was not a first look and final look diagnosis, as sometimes in medicine, but it was an accompanying process of trying to understand. And Steiner was undergoing a process. It is too easy to think that he saw it as a definitive image, because he tried to understand deeper. Ite Wegman said in the following month to Theodora Kunert that Steiner is still trying to understand better and better. So it was not a finished diagnosis. Sometimes we have these fixed diagnoses, they are just as a labeling. But a true diagnosis is an insight which is going really to the origins. Originally, the art of diagnosing means to go to the onset, which is very difficult, because what is the real onset of a disease? The real origins, the real beginnings, as Aristotle said. He said that the physicians, they should try to find the origins and not only the accidents or the circumstances which enabled a disease to come. This is more the manifestation. But where is the starting point? So what is Steiner describing, not as the starting point, not at all, I would say, but as a kind of phenomenologic situation, what he perceived in a kind of an inner image, that he said, first of all, what we had to realize that this child, even if, born in August and now seen in beginning of February, these are almost half a year, that he's still carrying elements of a state, of an embryo state. And not only because the head is quite big, which is typical in the proportion to the whole body for the embryon, the status of the unborn child, to say it less medical. But he said this is a continuation not only of the size, but also of the forces. And then on the level of these layers, what Steiner described in his new science of understanding human beings from a physical, from an etheric aspect, from a so-called astral aspect, astral body aspect, and from the eye organization, that he said what he had to realize, that the eye organization is not at all on the state of a 6 month old boy on Earth. It was stopped in the development in this early state of pregnancy. What was very strong was the astral body, and so strong that it had a difficulty to come into the etheric physical body, and this, he said, was causing these seizures. These are a trial to come in and in a way stopped. And then he said it is not only a very strong astral body, but the strange or unconventional thing, and maybe then Steiner was saying that this is not so often diagnosed, this is so close to the astral body of the mother. Such a affinity, such a kind of nearness. There is father in this kind of body formation. In this lecture, Dr. Steiner said, you know, the father aspect is in common very strong in the limb organization. So the forming of the head is by a lot of maternal influences, cosmic maternal influences. But the male aspect, but this was stopped in a way. So obviously the limb, metabolic link organism was almost tiny, but the strong head. Of course, from a pure medical point of view, we would say hydrocephalus, a lot of liquid, and that's it. But what is behind the hydrocephalus? Okay, you can say a mechanical problem, but maybe Aristotle would say, and what is behind the mechanical problem? So, I mean, these are all from a Goetheanistic point of view end results of processes of organic development. Steiner tried to describe the imbalanced situation, and especially what to do now. And I mean, to say it again, there was no school medicine option. And sometimes it's really good to say, because anthroposophical medicine is not avoiding school medicine options if they are available and if it's responsible to use them. So when the antibiotics were invented, Dr. Walter said to Dr. Wegmann, shall we use these new drugs? And Ito Wegmann said, yes, why not? But we should try to balance the counter effects. So it depends on, it is not a bad medicine. And especially surgery was one of the big, and still is, inventions of the 20th century. This very delicate surgery, which is maybe the best elaborated aspect of medicine now, in a way. But it was not available. So what to do with the boy? Of course, you can do lumbar punctures, but for a certain time, and then you will create infections over infections. Or you can do the brain surgery, and they all died. So Steiner, do we have another chance to balance it in a way? And what he proposed from the beginning, we can see it in the case report, we can't reduce the brain, but we shouldn't overactivate it all the time. That means when she said he is very sensitive to light and to all noises, he said we should protect him. Because in a way it's not only painful for him, but also by this stimulation, the brain is always activated and getting even stronger. So we need a kind of a sensory protection. And there are also possibilities on the level of anthroposophical drugs. Let's say plumbum injections in a certain dilution is fostering not an upbuilding activity, but a limiting activity on the right part of the body. And on the other side, in the limb metabolic organization, we have to support growth. We have to support activation. So there we need a kind of stimulation of this will organization, the formative forces. So Steiner developed a very complex treatment of substances, of massage, bath, and I won't develop it now again because this is not our main topic, but just to say, and he said it's open, it's open, it's an open, I can't say that it will work, but we can try if you want, he said from the beginning. And Ita Wegman saw after this first visit, Theodora Kunert quite often, and she posed again the questions, will you really do it? And she asked me in great detail whether I wanted to stick to Dr. Steiner and his opinion, and you too. This is a letter from Theodora to her husband. If we want to go on this line, or Steiner proposed, so both parents, not only the mother, and whether we would not at best say that it would have been better otherwise at the end. So if this is failing, maybe later on we thought maybe we should have tried the operation. Because Dr. Wegman said the matter is very serious and the outcome uncertain. I assured her on my own behalf and yours that we had no doubts, and that I would do everything I could as far as my strength allowed. The strength was questioned, because it's easy to say sensory protection, but it's hard to do. If you have a boy and it is at least February light, and you should protect him from light, and you are encouraged to create shadow and to darken the room, and maybe also the voices of the birds, and to protect. And this was very difficult for her, as far as my strength allowed. It's not so difficult to take these substances and the bath and the meditation, but this kind of how to protect the sensory system. Of course, it seems to be a little bit as Kaspar Hauser, but it's just the opposite, because it's from a therapeutical point of view. But to do it was very difficult for the mother, and not only for the mother, also for the family Frede she was living in. There is a letter from Elisabeth Frede to Ernst Kunert we found. Your dear brave wife follows all the instructions to the letter. Really, we all admire her for the courage and energy which she has taken on her difficult task. When Wilfriedchen recovers, he will be eternally grateful not only to the doctor, to whom he has everything to thank, but also to his mother, because together they are fighting for a human life. Witnessing this battle is something of a sacred mystery for us viewers, said Elisabeth Frede, living in the house. And again, she was very discreet and very distinctive with her wording. If she's saying a sacred mystery and a battle, so they all know it's life and death, and there is seemingly no third option. And even if the treatment is unconventional or very hard to do, and then the mother, Theodora, came to Ita Wegman with the question, if this is true, that my astral body in a way is too close to the one of Wilfried, she felt guilty, and we can totally understand this psychological interpretation, even if Steiner was never talking about the moral situation. But how to distinguish it is, if you hear as a mother, you are too close to your child on a certain level of your existence. And she brought the question to Ita Wegman, maybe, or the question shouldn't maybe we stop the breastfeeding in this kind of communication? And Ita Wegman advised to do so. Of course, it was now 7 months and it was possible, but it was not easy for her. And it was not easy for the father. I want to integrate a little bit also Ernst Kunert, because it was so touching to my heart, to be honest, to find these letters of Ernst Kunert. Quite often we talk about mother and a child, but there is a kind of a trinity, isn't it? I mean, there are father is also necessary for the formation of the body, but not only the body. Where is the father? And this father was active. We all know the story of the missing father, especially in the past. But this father was present even if he couldn't come. He couldn't afford to come. He had to finish his PhD and he had no money. And Switzerland was expensive and still is. But at this time, so he was sending letters. And of course, meditative. He was a strong spiritual person. And he was missing the boy and Theodora. I feel infinitely lonely without you. I have to sort everything out for myself. Your presence makes me feel so good, and I feel more connected to you than I have ever felt to anyone else. Wonderful, loving letters to Theodora, and also confessing his worries, also about the boy. You will confirm that all my love was also for the little one, and also the silent inner nameless pain for him, and the worry about a dark doom. So they were present, both, and they kept this presence. They kept this presence also after the next step, when she brought again the question if maybe also physical separation is advisable in this case. If a good nurse will overtake her caring for the boy, because maybe then there will be an autonomous development of his own layers of existence. And Steiner asked, is it not too difficult for you to do this step? Maybe it could be of help. And it's an extreme case, and in a way it's not a model, an archetype for curative education and relationships. We want to intensify relationships, but maybe Steiner would have said, yes, we also wanted to intensify, but maybe not by physical presence. And this is also a case which we know quite well in medicine. I'm a psychiatrist and psychotherapist. Sometimes we need to intensify the relationship by distance. It is not all the time possible by physical presence, even if in such an early childhood we will all the time in trying to intensify also physically. But in this very special situation, Steiner said, maybe it could be a help, but it is not too much for difficult for her. And she said she will all do what could eventually help that this balance will be newly found. But then she was terribly crying. And this is a very subtle description in her later memories about this talk to Dr. Steiner, this conversation where she was crying, and he let her cry. It's just sitting beside her, long time, and at the end a little bit comforting and being there. And she said, at the end of our meeting, I only remember me jumping down the Dornach hill with wings on my body and the feeling in my heart that nothing could ever happen to me again. She felt protected and secure. Of course, from a critical reader of this report, they would maybe say this kind of, what kind of an inner relationship to Steiner and the great healer. But she was a brilliant intellectual person. As far as I understood Dora Krug's life biography in psychology, she had no tendency to lose her own self-confidence or own standpoint. And Dr. Steiner, she had a lot of confidence, but she was controlled as far as I can see, but she felt reassured and is writing in a letter to Ernst Kunert about all her sorrows, but at the end she said, maybe everything will be all right again. And then there are also moments when I see everything in the light of eternity through another force and place it in a higher hand. Then I fell asleep quietly and without a wish in the light of the star that illuminates and protects our future. So in a way, they both tried not to forget the star of redemption, the star above them, and also the star of this soul of this Wilfried Emanuel. So at the end, she left Dornach and got him in the hands of Ita Wegmann's staff. She left after the Eastern lectures here. And if you remember them about the mystery of Ephesus, the mystery of being born, the forming of the ether body out of light, quite specific lectures. And yeah, when I wanted to thank Rudolf Steiner for everything after his last evening lecture outside the carpentry workshop, he disappeared with a quiet smile. She went back to her husband. He was living in Cologne then, and sending a letter to Ita Wegmann. My husband and I are fully aware that it is our son's great destiny in life to be able to be in Dornach in this way. The fact that you also made this possible for us by being extremely accommodating will bind me to you with everlasting gratitude. But Dr. Steiner didn't want to give Wilfried Emanuel just to a nurse. So he wanted to know them all. And there are some women, not all nurses, by the way, who offered their help, but he said, no, it's not the right person. So at the end, he found somebody. Margarete Seufert was her name. And I knew later on Herbert Seufert, her nephew. This was the father-in-law of Sergei Prokofiev, so the father of Astrid Prokofiev, and he told me the story of his aunt, Margarete Seufert, and he had a lot of notes of her, how she experienced this time. But the astonishing thing was that Ernst Kunert died. They found an apartment in Cologne, and they just moved in, and he was carrying something, and suddenly, with a cry or with a shouting, he fell down, and it was obviously a heart attack, a cardiac stroke, and he died in the hands of her. And this happened the day before Wilfried Emanuel was presented in the course. So on the way to the carpentry shop to talk about the child and to see the child, Dr. Steiner got a telegram. So when he then in the lecture came to Wilfried Emanuel, he mentioned that this happened. There are also wonderful letters, but it's too long now. In a way, we have the feeling from the letters that Ernst Kunert felt something will change in the near future for his life and biography. I don't think that he thought in the direction of death, but there are letters to Theodora quite remarkable and also kind of promises. I will carry you and support you. You will not grow weary, for I am here to repay your love, to stand by your side strong and faithful. And I think she felt accompanied also after he died. Yes, the presentation in the course is quite well known. It's not so known that the boy was brought in a basket into the lecture room or in the carpentry shop room by another boy. It was obviously the job of Richard Grob, another boy of the course, to bring in little Wilfried Emanuel, and then Steiner went into the basket and had the boy in his hands and went to the audience because they're sitting in 2 rows, a little group, and he brought the boy to them. Yes, now take a look at the enormous enlargement of a child's head as hydrocephalus. And then he explained what I tried to sketch about the treatment and said it is extremely difficult. And he said also the fact that we have not been able to achieve a reduction in size is due to the fact that the things are extremely strong from inside. I still hope that we will be able to harmonize the head to a certain degree once a certain point has been passed. And at the end he said, it is the same with human puzzles. The things that appear in such abnormalities, as they are called, are deeply illuminating in the life, not only of man, but of the whole cosmos. So this head, the size, the forces, the shaping forces, point and circle, and there are mysteries. And Steiner is struggling. He still hopes, he said. And probably you know that he grew up in a village where there was a man with a huge head, hydrocephalus, but he could live. He was part of the village and helped on the station. And Steiner described quite often this example, saying, this was integration, this was inclusiveness at this time. And then we know the story of Otto Specht, this boy of the family Specht, was given to Steiner for a curative education process. And he was so effective that the boy could go to school again and could do the Matura and studying medicine and becoming a doctor. And this third, but extreme situation was right at the end of Dr. Steiner's life. And he hoped that it will be possible. The blackboard drawing number 6 of the photograph has to do with this. And maybe number 7 now, there is this Dürer drawing. I mentioned before, they got it as a present to Christmas in Leipzig, and they brought it with them, Theodora, and it was all the time hanging over the little bed of the boy. And when she left, she kept, of course, the relationship to the boy, but also to those who took care for him. So we have some letters, and also she sent clothes and other things. And it was not a stopped relationship, but they tried to improve a situation which at the end they could not. They could not. And Steiner, he himself died on the 30th of March. Till that day, I think he was in contact by Ite Wegmann, and with the boy he knew about. He was part of this Dornach-Arlesheim Sonnenhof Holle life. As Rudolf Grosse, who came finishing his school time in Stuttgart as a helper to the Sonnenhof, mentioned in his memories that he saw this little Wilfried Emanuel and said, I was moved by the beauty of his face. And I can say that I have never seen a child with such a superhuman, angelic expression as this little Emanuel. At the end, there was only Ite Wegmann, obviously, who believed till he died that there could be a change, because in fact there was no change. But he said, we don't know, maybe. And we know that for therapists and doctors, it's good to carry hope. If we lose hope, we lose our patients, Dr. Steiner said to the doctors. So exactly 8 months after Dr. Steiner passed away, Wilfried Emanuel found the same way. In the 8th photograph now, you see the notebook entry of the nurse or the person who took care. She's writing in German there. Wilfried died at 9 o'clock in the morning. The children were praying the prayer of thanksgiving in the next room at that moment. It is this quite well-known children, but maybe not only children, praying, Erde, die uns dies gebracht, Sonne, die es reif gemacht, liebe Sonne, liebe Erde, eurer nie vergessen werde. Earth that brought us this, sun that makes it ripe, dear sun, dear earth, I will never forget you. But there are probably better translation. But at the end of the notebook entry, she's writing, I could be with Wilfried Emanuel all day until late at night. So he was really very wonderful, surrounded and treated as a holy person, even if they couldn't create him a new balance of forces. Ita Wegman gave the funeral address on the 2nd of December. And then they received a letter from the mother, maybe many letters, but one is preserved, Christmas letter, and there Theodora Kunert is writing, may Wilfried himself, who is no longer a child and more powerful than I am, be with you, with his thanks, that he may be a blessing for our great cause, unsere große Sache, our great intention. I think she's meaning curative education. Maybe she's also meaning the anthroposophical Michaelic movement. So that he may be a blessing for our great cause in which we are all united through the ages. So at this point, and 40 years later, more than 40 years later, Theodora Kunert had the feeling that it is the beginning of a new epoch. So she titled her report The Aufbruch der Kinder 1924. So the starting element or the impulse of those who came in 24. So not of the helpers, they were only reacting to the need, but those who incarnated and created and helped to create and to build a new movement with new ethical values of what is human life, what are relationships, what are ethics on earth. And yeah, she finished her report, Dora Kruk. She married again later on. Her name was Dora Kruk von Potocin. She finished the report on the 5th of January, 1968. And then was Epiphany. And then she died on the 7th of January, 1968. So this was her last. And I will end now with this quotation from Elisabeth Frede in her letter to the baptism. I quoted one sentence and I will bring some others. She was writing to Wilfried Emanuel, you shall now also be Baptist so that you can become a real Wilfried Emanuel. I would like to say a nice little saying to you. Let your little angel whisper it in your ear, but only for the baptism. In das Licht hineingeboren, bist du nun ein Sonnenwesen. Liebe bringe du der Erde, dass sie wieder kann genesen. So maybe to translate, born into light, are you now a sun being? Bring love to the earth, that she can recover. An enormous saying, or that the boy or the individuality is maybe bringing love to the earth, because the earth has to be healed or can recover eventually. I don't think that she wanted to interpret his whole life and life mission, but in a way it is touching, an individuality which was only touching the earth, not fully incarnated. But I think for the parents, for the surrounding, for the therapists, it was a huge impact. And I'm sure that Ita Weigmann never forgot Wilfried Emanuel till her end of her life. And when Ita Weigmann died, it was the 4th of March, 1943, in the middle of the Second World War. Theodora Kunert was hidden from the bombs in Stuttgart. And then she got the message that Ita Weigmann left the earth. And in the same night, or the next night, she had to go under the earth in such a kind of to protect her life against the bombings. And then there was a little Russian girl suddenly praying. And in the praying, the little Russian girl said, she was including her prayer, the English soldiers in the airplanes with the bombing, that they will find a safe return home. So the Russian girl was praying for those who were bombing Stuttgart at this time, or at least praying that these soldiers have a safe way home. And I mention it because Theodora Kunert, who listened to it, had a feeling this was almost an inspiration of Ita Weigmann, having just gone, that a Russian child is praying for English soldiers being bombed in Germany. So I only wanted to say Ita Weigmann's life with Wilfried Emanuel, and then over the threshold, for the mother of Wilfried Emanuel, this was always an important spiritual factor, accompanying her biography and the biography of Ita Weigmann, and maybe the word of dass sie wieder kann genesen, supporting earth, that means also earthly destinies. This was really truly meant, and not only a phrase, but how extraordinary that it was to the baptism. It was before the tragic story happened that the godmother Elisabeth Frede came to such verses. Maybe I have did an overinterpretation now, but in a way I have to say it is touching, the whole story. So as I said at the beginning and in the middle, it is not an archetype for healing, curative education, and of course it is better and easier to talk about others of these children of the curative education course, and we shouldn't make out a model out of it, but it is part of our history, that means of our conscience, of our historical conscience. And working in Ita Weigmann's house, I have the feeling we shouldn't forget Wilfried Emanuel, but also Theodora Kunert, and also Ernst Kunert, Elisabeth Frede, and all those who were involved at this time. Thank you for the intensity of listening. It is a serious telling, a serious story, but maybe needed. I don't know. Thank you at all. And now we make a short break, and then Constanza Kaliks will go on about the central meditation of the curative education course.
In this course, where Rudolf Steiner brought this child and this destiny in the group of those who then would take over this unbelievable endeavor to be education, to enable education also for those who would have other kinds of difficulties, of hindrances in this world. Rudolf Steiner brought on the 10th lecture, 2 days after he brought this history of this child, he brought on the 10th lecture a meditation for those who would then become curative educators. And today I would like shortly to introduce this very, very impressive content of this meditation from one point of view. There are for sure many others, wonderful points of view, and I would like to introduce it from the point of view first of the act of meditating itself. Then I would like to describe a little bit the history, the genealogy of this meditation, to then go into the lecture and the way Rudolf Steiner presented it to those who were there. So it can be a little bit astonishing if we read this 10th lecture, in which way we can say a little bit without, in a very unexpected way, he just bring it into this stream of descriptions of the human beings that he was doing. And years ago, many times, he would describe what means to meditate and what is the human transformation possible through meditation. And I would like to now quote some lines of the lecture he gave, of one lecture he gave in the so-called pedagogical youth course, almost 2 years before. And in this course, speaking to these young persons in Stuttgart, he will describe what happens when we really dive into this meditative effort. And later, when I read some quotes from the lecture of the healing pedagogical course, maybe we will be able to hear again almost the same formulation or very similar formulation on what happened with the human being if the human being really decides to go into this exercise of meditation. And he describes this to these young persons. Most or many of them wanted to become, at that point, teachers. And he says, well, spiritual science must invite to such inner activity, that is, it must lead all observations to the point where one no longer has any points of reference in the external central view, and the inner play of forces can move freely. Assume then that you can have thoughts in the pure flow of thought. Then the moment begins for you when you have led thinking to a point where it no longer needs to be called thinking at all. For this thinking, rightly called pure thinking, has become pure will. It is will through and through. If you have come so far in the soul that you have liberated thinking from external perception, then it has at the same time become pure will. And this pure course of thought is then a course of will. With this, however, thinking and even the effort that follows its exercise begins to be not only an exercise of thought, but an exercise of will, and one that reaches to the center of the human being. An exercise of will that reaches at the center of the human being. But now you feel inwardly that you are no longer thinking so high up, but that you are beginning to think with your chest. You are actually interviewing your thinking with a breathing process. As thinking becomes more and more an activity of the will, you realize that it first emerged from the human chest and then from the whole human body. A new inner human being is born in you who can bring forth the development of the will from the spirit. And then, when he presents the meditation in the 10th lecture of the course that we are speaking about, he will say, yes, this will change the relation to the will that enables us to be active in the world. And now, and many of you probably may know this unbelievable, beautiful picture that Rudolf Steiner presents when he says, introducing the meditation, you can meditate that you will in the evening say, in me is God. And in the morning, when you wake up, you will say, I am in God. And then he draws also. He makes a drawing, a circle and a point, blue and yellow, and then yellow and blue. And he will describe that. I will come back to that. He just brings this content for meditation. And this content is connected to a very, very old meditation in the Western tradition. And I will now say some of these moments in which this meditation appears very clearly through different persons in the history of Western meditative endeavor. And most of that what I will bring, or some of that what I will bring, is from a very, very beautiful book written by Dietrich Manke, a German philosopher and historian of mathematics. He wrote this book in the beginning of the 20th, so in the first years of the 20th century, and his book's name is Unendliche Sphäre und Allmittelpunkt, Endless Sphere and Constant Present Central Point. And he discovered that this meditation is rooted, and I will say the way in which this meditation was traditionally said, is rooted in very ancient times. And the first moment in which we can see it appearing in history is with Hermes Trismegisto. So it's really, really very old. And again it will appear, and for long centuries it will appear in Europe in the Latin language. And the way it was expressed was the following: Deus est sphera infinita, cuius centrum est ubique, circumferentia nusquam. And that means God is an infinite sphere, which centrum is all places, is all around, and which circumference is nowhere. God is an infinite sphere with the centrum all around and with the circumference nowhere. We will hear that, or we will read that, as Master Eckhart said it in Paris in 1294, so the 13th century, in Paris in an Easter sermon. And he says, God is the infinite sphere, its center is everywhere, its circumferences is nowhere. So we can see this thought to be meditated, but first to be thought. God is an infinite sphere. God as an infinite sphere. And if we just start imagining that, what is that? An infinite sphere, a sphere that is infinite wide. And then we immediately can feel, or we can at least sense, that the center is everywhere. Because the center could be here where I am, the center could be where you are, The center is everywhere because this sphere is infinite. And the surrounding and the circumference, the limits, are nowhere. And so we can feel the depth of that imagination if we imagine that God as an infinite sphere with a center everywhere, with a circumference nowhere. And this was experienced repeatedly as a meditation, as an inner image, as an inner possibility to connect with that what was felt as God. And the next moment in which we see that appearing in the Western culture is through a person named Nicholas of Cues, who lived in the 15th century and who is a very important person in this transition from an old relation to spirituality to that what would then start, and that is modernity with natural science, with the possibility to see the world not anymore in the expectation first to see the image of a transcendental God, but to see the world with the eyes of human wisdom, with the eyes of human observation, of human knowledge. And Nicholas of Cues is in this transition, and in this transition what he tries is to understand and to search for ways to meet that what, as he writes in his most well-known book, the Docta Ignorantia, the learned ignorance, he writes, are we able to meet the maximum, the all-embracing, or that what the people name God, are we able to meet that without forgetting our capacity of knowing? That means not only with our faith, not only in the expectation of revelation, in the preparation for revelation, but out of knowledge, out of that what is possible to be known in the world. And his whole work will be an attempt to bring examples in which the human being, using his capacity of thinking, would be able to experience that what he says is the most important quality of God. And the most important quality of God is, in his words, the coincidence of the opposites, the coincidentia oppositorum. He says, whatever we know in the world, it is in such a way that it can be something or not be that. So this is a desk or it is not a desk. This is a hand or it is not a hand. There is no possibility in between for something that we know in the world to be and at the same time to not be that. But for God, he says, because he is the maximum, the all-embracing, for God, that is not true anymore. In God, he says, the opposites coincide, come together, because God is everywhere, embraces all, so he would be the biggest, but at the same time the smallest. He would be the brightest, but at the same time the darkest. So in God, the opposites will coincide. And this is because this absolute infiniteness of the reality of God. And so he brings many, many different examples, symbolic examples for the human being to think through, in which through thinking we can go very close and even touch this coincidence of the opposites. That is not now the topic of this thoughts, and so I will just leave it like that. But for sure, he went through this thinking, Nicholas of Cues, and going through this thinking, he could open the door to then something appear as a perception. And what he writes in his book is that if there is the universe is infinite because God is infinite, then the earth would be one center of this infinite universe, but also the sun. And every star, he says, every star is one center of an infinite universe. And every human being is his center of this infinite reality of the universe. And so through thinking, through a symbolic thinking, he makes it possible for the understanding, for the knowledge, we can say, to be prepared to then, almost 100 years later, the discoveries that through Galileo Galilei, through Giordano Bruno, especially through Nicolaus Copernicus, could be done through then the telescope. What they could see through the telescope was already been thought and imagined, and we can say anticipated by an inner disposition through these thoughts that Nicolaus of Cues developed. And so I want to read one quote of his book, The Docta Ignorantia, The Learned Ignorance, the second part. He writes, he describes in which way we can understand that because God is everything, everything will be also in God. In this way, it is possible to gain insight into how God, who is the simplest unity, since he exists in the one all, is, as it were, consequently in all things, through the mediation of the all. And the multiplicity of things are in God, through the mediation of the one all. So, the multiplicity of things are all in God, and God is in all things. Yeah, and we can say that he opens the possibility through this thinking, through that what would be then a cosmology born out of this possibility, to anticipate something that then would become an expression of the experience reality. And one of those who really took him very serious, many of them, of those important astronomers at that point, but one of those was Giordano Bruno. And it's very remarkable, Giordano Bruno, who lived from 1548 and died in February 600. Giordano Bruno was also, for Rudolf Steiner, as many of you may know, a very, very important person. And the book from which I will quote two little passages now, this book was very well known by Rudolf Steiner, very, very early probably in his time in Vienna. He had this book in German, the German translation, The Cause, the Principle and the Unity, written in 1584. And there, Giordano Bruno writes the following: the world is infinite because God is infinite. How can we believe that God, who is infinite, could have limited himself by creating a closed and limited world? So we see out of the thinking that God is infinite, the certainty that then the creation couldn't be limited. And he also writes, we need not seek divinity outside ourselves, for it is on our side, or rather in our inner depths, more intimately within us than we are within ourselves. So we need not seek divinity outside ourselves, for it is on our side, or rather in our inner depths, and more intimately within us than we are within ourselves. And then Giordano Bruno will transfer, as we could now maybe sense in these two little quotes, he will transfer these divine predicates to the universe. That what was true for God, God is the unendless sphere, which has a center everywhere and which has a circumference nowhere, that will be then the predicates, the qualities, the expression of the universe. And from then on, we have this image: the universe is an endless sphere with a center everywhere and with the circumference nowhere. Yeah, so in a certain sense, Giordano Bruno completed the secularization of this first, we can say, religious thinking. And he brings this in such a way that this will be the fundament, the ground for that what will become then the modern natural science. And we can see that there is really a preparation so that the eyes will be able to see that what first the spirit or the mind was able to think. And others will also take this image later, as Jakob Böhme, as Pascal, and also as Leibniz. And Leibniz will say in the 17th century, in the 18th century, God is central everywhere. God is central everywhere. In a very, sharp way. And we will see then that this conviction, that this experience, that the center is wherever a star is, that the center is wherever a person is, and that all these centers are in a deep connection and in a mutual, necessary relation, as Giordano Bruno says. All those centers, all those stars are there because the others are also there, and they help each other in this extension of the cosmos, thanks to the laws of the space, thanks to the laws of gravity. And this is an unbelievable picture, also in a certain sense anticipating that what will become in the 20th century, this very deep experience that the mutuality, the relation, is what enables also the human being to stay and become human. And now I would like to go to the meditation with a little bit this background that was for sure known by Rudolf Steiner. As I said, he wrote Cusanus, Nicholas of Cus, he wrote Giordano Bruno, knew this very, very old content. And as is also mentioned before, he starts in a certain sense bringing this meditation in a very unexpected way. First, he was asking those who were sitting there if they have been able to observe the children, to see the children, to see all that. And he says, well, the youth is full of very big ideals and big expectations. And of course, these young people, they had huge ideals and huge expectations. They would then develop something totally new, this new education for these children and these young people. And he says, it's good to have these ideals, but we need to be very humble, and we need to overcome any vanity and any abstraction, and we need to develop the devotion to the smallest reality facts. the devotion to what is, and the devotion to see what is. And then he will say, and I would like to quote that, the way in which he then brings this meditation. In general, people cannot achieve anything in the field of education because they have never seriously awakened a truth within themselves. So it is about awakening a truth within ourselves. And this consists in the fact that in the evening you live into the consciousness, in me is God. In me is God, or the Spirit of God, or whatever. But not just theoretically imagining it. Most people's meditations consist of theoretically imagining something, and then in the morning in such a way that it radiates into the whole day, I am in God. Just think, when you realize these two ideas, which become quite sensations for you, even impulses of the will, then you are actually doing right. You are doing this by having this image before you, God is in me, and then I am in God. And then he draws it, and maybe we can see the drawing now with these two circles, this image with the blue circle and the yellow point, and the yellow circle and the blue point. And then he continues saying, but the meditation that works in such things must not have the mood, my dear friends, I want to lie down in a warm nest inside, I want it to get warmer and warmer, but it must have the mood that one immerses oneself in reality, that one immerses himself in reality, that one grasps reality. Devotion to the small, yes, to the smallest things, interest in this smallness must not be exercised, my dear friends. It must be so that the earlobe, the cut fingernail, a piece of the human hair interests you just as much as Saturn, the sun, or the moon. So this interest, he introduced this unbelievable image, in me is God, I am in God, and that for what? To awake in our will the possibility to approach our interest to the smallest things in reality. And then he says, therefore, my dear friends, it is necessary, if you really want to become educators, that you develop this devotion in the smallest thing, in the most humble way, and then, on this basis, also awakens this devotion to the small things in the rest of every experience. And then he goes on and he says, have you seen? Very concretely he asks, what have you done with that what the mother of the girl yesterday have told you? And then in the book you can read it, it's written silence. And then he asks again these young persons there, what have you done with the answers that the mother of the child gave you yesterday about the questions we asked her? And again silence. And then he says, this is not enough. It's not enough to have big ideals. We need to develop this interest. And he says, and with that we will be fulfilled of enthusiasm. That is, I read it, that is precisely it. The enthusiasm in experiencing the truth. That is what must be there. That is what has pained me so terribly for so many years also, that people stand so firmly on their feet, but they are not interested in the things. And then he asked them, why don't you become a dancer in the sense that Zarathustra meant? Live with the innermost joy of truth. To live with the innermost joy of truth. There is nothing more delightful than experiencing the truth. And this is something that is much more important and essential than what goes around with long faces. This inner experience of the truth is what must long precede all other persuasions of a mission. So he brings this meditation as a possibility of experiencing truth and as an exercise to be done every day to develop interest in the most little details of reality. And out of that, he expects the joy for that, a joy for this truth. And we can again go back maybe to that what happened with this very old meditation in history of humankind as an anticipation for something to then be experienced with the senses. And we see here a very close relation. Rudolf Steiner brings that as a tool to awake the possibility to see the child, to see the reality, also the physical reality, the forms, the shapes, all what is around us. And in this meditation, in a certain sense, we anticipate the possibility to experience the wholeness of reality. He says, settle into the consciousness in the evening, in me is God, in me is the Spirit of God or whatever, and in the morning I am in God. And now I would like to go in the direction of finishing this short presentation with another image that is very close to this one that Rudolf Steiner brings in the meditation, and also very close, or I would say very rooted in the same experience that is possible through the meditation. God is the endless sphere with a center everywhere and with a circumference nowhere. And this was developed, was expressed by a person who lived in the same century as Giordano Bruno. And this person is Isaac Luria. He was a Jewish person, a wise Jewish man who developed, or who gave the ground for the development of many of these wisdoms coming from the Jewish Kabbalah. He was born 1534 in Jerusalem, and he died in August 1572 in Safed in Galilee. And he developed this wisdom that then one of his students, one of his scholars, Chaim Vital, would then write down. And what we know is from the writings of Chaim Vital. And Isaac Luria describes the act of creation of this all-embracing God. And this act of creation is an act of stepping back, is an act of enabling the other, the otherness to appear out of a willing stepping back. And I would like to read it. It is in a certain sense deeply connected to this endless sphere that in a certain sense we experience always from us on to all around. It is deeply connected, but in a certain sense it isn't different or way around experience in a certain sense. So, know that before things were created, there was a simple supreme light that filled all that was present. There was no empty space in the sense of empty air or space. Rather, everything was filled with the simple light of the infinite, also called Ein Sof. And there was no such thing as beginning or end, but everything was a single, simple, self-same light. And this is called the light of the infinite. And behold, the infinite drew itself back into the center within itself, truly into the center of this light, into the center of its light. And then it drew that light together and removed itself to the sides around the center, so that now an unoccupied place remained of the center, empty air and empty space. I read these lines again. And behold, the infinite drew itself back into the center with itself, truly into the center of its light. And then it drew that light together and removed itself to the sides around the center, so that now an unoccupied place remained of the center, empty air and space. And then this is described as the gesture of creation, described as the gesture of this enabling something, an otherness, to appear. And we can go back to this deep meditation that Rudolf Steiner offers. In me is God, and God is in me, and having this experience of this light that enables, because it goes back, something to be there. And now I would like to close these short considerations just going back a little bit to this destiny that 2 days before Rudolf Steiner described in this course. And if we remember the drawing that was also shown, this head of the child, and all this, concern about the head, about this spheric part in the human being. And Rudolf Steiner describes the relation in between the head and the whole cosmos. He says the head is in a certain sense an image of the wholeness of the cosmos in the human being. And he describes that, very interesting, in the last lecture he gave, in these 14 lectures that were there for preparing the first teachers of the first Waldorf school to receive their children in classroom. It is the last lecture, the 14th lecture of the study of man, the study of the human being, on the 5th of September 1919, where he describes this unbelievable extension of the reality of the forces that builds the head, and the head then appears as a little thing. We could say in the grown-up body, and the little child is bigger compared to the wholeness of the figure. But he says there we have the strength and the forces, the dynamic forces of the wholeness of the cosmos. And so we can maybe sense a little bit in which relation also we can see this shape of the human body, of the human physical body, together with this unbelievable wide horizon of the wholeness of the cosmos, in the sense of that, what then 2 days later he will bring as a meditation content for those who are preparing themselves to learn every day again to see what is there in the child, in the human being. Yeah, thank you very much for your attentiveness. We are very grateful as General Anthroposophical Section that we could bring that elements of this course that happened 100 years ago, and as Peter Selg already said in the first lecture, out of that impulse, so many destinies could have another way, maybe, as it would be if this course have never been given. And in this sense, thank you very much to be here with us, and have a good evening.